On the morning of March 14, 1853, the entire social order of Southside, Virginia, shattered with a single discovery. 23-year-old Catherine Dunmore, eldest daughter of one of the region's wealthiest tobacco planters, had vanished from her bedroom sometime during the night. With her disappeared Samuel, a 26-year-old enslaved man valued in her father's ledgers at $1,200. But what terrified the community wasn't simply the flight itself. It was what searchers found hidden beneath loose floorboards in Catherine's chamber. 47 letters written in Samuel's hand detailing not an abduction, but a meticulously planned escape that had been orchestrated for over 18 months. The implications were unspeakable. Authorities buried the evidence immediately. And for 170 years, the true story of what happened remained sealed in courthouse records too scandalous to acknowledge until now. Before we continue with the story of Catherine Dunmore and the impossible choice that would destroy two families and reshape an entire county's understanding of loyalty, betrayal, and the terrible price of forbidden connection, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city or state in the comments below. Now, let's discover what really happened in the spring of 1853 when the unthinkable became reality. The letters would tell only part of the story. The rest would emerge in testimonies given under duress, in whispered confessions, and in the horrifying discovery made 6 months later in a cabin 30 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line. Dunmore Hall stood 3 miles outside the town of Boydton, Virginia, a 2-story brick manor house that commanded views of rolling tobacco fields stretching toward the North Carolina border. The estate encompassed nearly 800 acres worked by 53 enslaved people who lived in weathered cabins arranged in neat rows beyond the main house. Colonel James Dunmore, a widower since 1847, ran his plantation with military precision learned during his brief service in the Mexican War. His reputation throughout Mecklenburg County was unimpeachable: a church elder, a mason, a man who paid his debts and kept his word. Catherine had been raised in this world of rigid certainty. After her mother's death from fever when Catherine was 17, she had assumed management of the household, overseeing the kitchen, the dairy, the gardens, and the domestic staff. She was known throughout the county as a capable, if somewhat reserved, young woman. She had refused 3 marriage proposals by the time she reached 21, a fact that caused considerable speculation among neighboring families. Her father indulged her independence, perhaps because she managed his household so efficiently, perhaps because he still mourned his wife and could not bear to send his daughter away. Samuel had come to Dunmore Hall in 1849, purchased from an estate sale in Richmond. His previous owner, a schoolmaster, had taught him to read and write before dying suddenly, leaving debts that forced his widow to sell her late husband's property. Colonel Dunmore bought Samuel specifically for his literacy, intending to use him as a clerk to manage plantation records and correspondence. It was unusual, even controversial, to have a literate enslaved person, but Colonel Dunmore believed in efficiency over tradition. For 2 years, Samuel worked in the small office attached to the main house, maintaining ledgers, copying letters, and managing the mundane paperwork of tobacco cultivation. He was quiet, meticulous, and careful never to presume beyond his assigned duties. He ate his meals alone, lived in a small room off the office rather than in the slave quarters, and kept himself apart from the other enslaved workers. Some resented his privileges, others simply ignored him. He existed in a strange liminal space, too educated for fieldwork, too enslaved for freedom. The Virginia of 1853 operated under rules as immutable as natural law. White and black occupied separate worlds, separated by laws that prescribed every interaction, every boundary, every consequence for transgression. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made the North less safe for runaways, with federal commissioners authorized to force the return of escaped slaves and punish anyone who aided them. Tensions between abolitionists and slave catchers had turned the border states into a battlefield of ideology and economics. In this landscape of rigid hierarchy, Catherine and Samuel's daily interactions had been unremarkable for nearly 2 years. She would bring household accounts for him to transcribe. He would prepare correspondence for her father's signature. They spoke only of practical matters, always in the presence of others, always maintaining the careful distance that society demanded. No one could say precisely when things changed, but sometime during the summer of 1851, Conversations that should have remained brief began to extend. Questions about bookkeeping became discussions of literature. Samuel had read extensively during his years with the schoolmaster, Shakespeare, Milton, the classics that formed the foundation of educated thought. Catherine, educated by tutors but starved for intellectual companionship in the isolated plantation world, found herself drawn into discussions that began about plantation business and ended elsewhere entirely. By autumn of that year, Catherine had begun visiting the office more frequently, often in the evening hours when her father was occupied with his own business. She brought books from the house library, volumes her father never opened. Samuel would read passages aloud, his voice careful and measured, always stopping the moment anyone else approached. These sessions were never acknowledged openly. If questioned, Catherine would explain she was reviewing accounts. Samuel never spoke of them at all. The winter of 1851 passed without incident. But in the spring of 1852, something shifted. Catherine began appearing in the office with a troubled expression, her questions becoming more direct, more dangerous. She asked about Samuel's life before Dunmore Hall. She asked what he thought about the debates raging in Congress over slavery's expansion westward. She asked questions that could get him killed simply for answering honestly. Samuel's responses, recorded later in testimony, were always measured. He never forgot, could never afford to forget, the nature of their positions. But he answered, and in those answers, delivered in his precise, educated voice, Catherine began to see not the property her father's ledgers described, but something her world had taught her was impossible to acknowledge. By summer of 1852, the impossible had become undeniable. The exact nature of their relationship would be debated, disputed, and distorted in the months to come. But what cannot be denied is this. By August of that year, Catherine and Samuel had begun planning an escape that would require betraying everyone Catherine had ever known and risking both their lives in pursuit of something that had no name in the language of 1853 Virginia. The planning was meticulous. Samuel, with access to plantation records, knew exactly how much cash Colonel Dunmore kept in the house safe. He knew the schedule of the night watchmen who patrolled the slave quarters. He knew which routes north were most heavily monitored by slave catchers and which were less traveled. Catherine contributed knowledge Samuel could never have obtained: the social calendar of the county's elite families, the timing of her father's business trips, the layout of the main house's interior. They corresponded through letters hidden in the false bottom of the accounts ledger, a space Samuel had carefully constructed during the long winter evenings. Catherine would leave her letters there when she brought the household accounts. Samuel would reply, and she would retrieve his responses the following day. It was incredibly dangerous. Discovery would mean Samuel's certain death and Catherine's social destruction, but they continued through autumn and into winter. The letters accumulated, 47 in total, each one more detailed, more intimate, more damning than the last. They discussed routes and timing. They discussed Quaker families rumored to help fugitives. They discussed the practical necessities of travel and the philosophical implications of their choice. And in language carefully coded to obscure their true meaning should the letters be discovered, they discussed why they were willing to risk everything for something Virginia law said could not exist. By March 1853, every detail was in place. Colonel Dunmore would travel to Richmond on the 13th for tobacco negotiations. The house would be managed by the elderly housekeeper, who retired early every night. The night watchman changed his route at predictable intervals. Samuel had secretly copied a key to the house safe months earlier. Catherine had sewn traveling clothes and packed them in a trunk she claimed held winter garments being sent to poor relations in Tennessee. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they were not the only ones planning something that spring. And the secret they were so carefully guarding was just one layer of a deception that ran much deeper than either of them imagined. The night of March 13, 1853 was moonless and cold, with the kind of darkness that swallows sound and makes familiar landscapes alien. Colonel Dunmore had departed for Richmond that morning as planned, riding in his carriage with his manservant, a journey that would keep him away for 3 days. The house settled into its evening routine with mechanical predictability. Catherine retired to her room at 9 o'clock, as was her custom. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hawthorne, checked on her briefly before heading to her own quarters in the back wing. The house grew quiet. Downstairs, Samuel completed his evening tasks, banking the fire in the office and arranging the next day's correspondence on Colonel Dunmore's desk. To any observer, it was an evening like any other. What happened next would have to be reconstructed from evidence and testimony, as there were no witnesses to the actual departure. Sometime between 10 o'clock and midnight, Samuel moved through the darkened house with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every step. He used his copied key to open the safe in Colonel Dunmore's study, removing approximately $300 in gold and paper currency, not the full amount, but enough to fund their journey without making the theft immediately obvious. Catherine, meanwhile, had not undressed for bed. She wore traveling clothes beneath her nightgown, and her packed trunk waited in the wardrobe. At the appointed time, they had synchronized their pocket watches weeks earlier. She descended the servants' staircase that led from her room to the rear of the house, avoiding the main stairs, where a creaking board on the third step might betray her movement. They met in the summer kitchen, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway. Samuel had prepared a small wagon earlier, claiming he needed to transport documents to town the following morning. It waited now behind the kitchen, loaded with supplies hidden beneath canvas. According to the reconstruction investigators later performed, they left Dunmore Hall on foot, pulling the small wagon behind them, taking a path through the tobacco fields that kept them away from the main road and the slave quarters. The night watchman, making his rounds, saw nothing. The dogs, familiar with both Catherine and Samuel, did not bark. By dawn they were 15 miles north, having abandoned the wagon in a ravine and continued on foot through dense forest. They followed a route Samuel had carefully planned using landmarks he had memorized from maps in the office, specific creek crossings, distinctive rock formations, the ruins of an old mill. The discovery came at 7 o'clock the following morning when Mrs. Hawthorne knocked on Catherine's bedroom door to wake her and received no response. Opening the door, she found the bed empty, clearly not slept in. The wardrobe stood open, and the trunk that should have been there was gone. Mrs. Hawthorne's first thought was that Catherine had been taken ill and gone to stay with neighbors, but something about the scene troubled her. She descended to the main house and found Samuel's room similarly empty. His few possessions remained, but he was gone. With growing alarm, she checked the office and discovered the correspondence from the previous day still unsent, highly unusual for Samuel's meticulous habits. When she reported this to the overseer, a crude man named Taggart who managed the field workers, he immediately suspected Samuel had run. A quick check of Catherine's room revealed no signs of struggle, and the discovery that her traveling clothes and personal items were missing transformed concern into horror. Taggart rode immediately to the neighboring plantation where he sent riders in multiple directions, one to Richmond to inform Colonel Dunmore, others to alert the county magistrate and organize a search party. By noon, 25 men had assembled at Dunmore Hall, and the true nature of the situation began to emerge. It was Taggart who found the letters. Searching Samuel's room for any clue to his destination, he discovered the false bottom in the account's ledger that Samuel had failed to destroy in his haste. The letters inside, written in Samuel's distinctive hand and addressing Catherine with an intimacy that made the searchers recoil in shock, left no doubt that this was not an abduction, but a planned escape. The magistrate, a thin man named Howell who had known Catherine since childhood, read 3 of the letters before ordering them sealed. What he had read, coded language that still made the relationship's nature unmistakable, represented a scandal that could destroy not just the Dunmore family, but the social foundations everyone depended upon. He gathered the letters, locked them in his saddlebag, and made a decision that would be debated for years after. The official story became simple. Samuel had kidnapped Catherine and fled north, likely intending to sell her to abolitionists who would use her as propaganda against the Southern way of life. It was a kidnapping, nothing more. The letters, Howell declared, were forged by Samuel to cast suspicion on Catherine and cover his crime. But everyone who had read those letters knew the truth, and that truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. Colonel Dunmore returned from Richmond on the evening of March 15, riding through the night after. Receiving word, he found his home transformed into the headquarters of a manhunt, with men camped in his fields and horses tied to every available post. Taggart met him at the door and delivered the news with careful phrasing, emphasizing the kidnapping narrative. Colonel Dunmore listened in silence, his face carved from stone. He asked one question: "Where are the letters?" When shown them, He read each one in complete silence. When he finished, he looked at Magistrate Howell and said only, "Burn them." Howell hesitated. "Colonel, these are evidence." "Burn them," Colonel Dunmore repeated, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Or I will." The letters were not burned. Howell had them copied first in secret before sealing the originals in the courthouse vault. The copies he kept locked in his personal safe, insurance against a future he suspected would need the truth, however painful. The search parties fanned out across Virginia following reported sightings and rumored routes. Catherine and Samuel, meanwhile, had already crossed into North Carolina, moving through a landscape that seemed to grow more dangerous with each mile. They traveled at night, hid during the day, and relied on a network of contacts that Samuel had painstakingly researched: Quaker families, free black communities, and sympathetic farmers who asked no questions. But they were not alone in the landscape. Behind them came not just the official search parties, but something far more dangerous: slave catchers who had read about the reward Colonel Dunmore had posted. $500 for Samuel's return, dead or alive, and $1,000 for information leading to Catherine's safe recovery. The reward notice, distributed across 3 states, carefully maintained the kidnapping narrative. But the amounts told their own story. No one posted such sums for a simple runaway and his victim. What neither Catherine nor Samuel knew, what they couldn't have known, was that the letters Howell had sealed contained information that made their escape infinitely more complex than anyone suspected. And back at Dunmore Hall, as the investigation continued, searchers would make a discovery in Catherine's room that would transform the scandal from merely shocking to absolutely catastrophic. The discovery came 3 days after the flight when Mrs. Hawthorne, cleaning Catherine's room with the desperate energy of someone trying to restore order to chaos, found a loose floorboard beneath the bedside table. Prying it up, she discovered a small wooden box containing items that made her cry out in shock. Inside the box, a daguerreotype of Samuel, clearly commissioned secretly, as no photographer in Mecklenburg County would have created such an image. Beside it, a woman's wedding ring, simple gold, sized for Catherine's finger. And beneath these, a letter in Catherine's own handwriting, unfinished, dated 2 weeks before the escape. Mrs. Hawthorne read only the first lines before dropping it as if burned. "Dearest Samuel," it began. "By the time you read this, we will either have succeeded in our flight or perished in the attempt. But I write this to leave a record, should we fail, of the truth that Virginia law prevents us from speaking. The child I carry is yours." The letter was never completed. What Catherine had intended to write in the rest of that letter, what she had planned to do with it, would never be known, but its existence transformed everything. This was not simply a flight for freedom or even a forbidden romance. This was a woman fleeing with the father of her unborn child, a child that Virginia law would have automatically enslaved at birth. A child whose very existence would have been an abomination to the society that birthed them. Both. Mrs. Hawthorne brought the box to Taggart with trembling hands. He brought it to Magistrate Howell. Howell, reading the unfinished letter, made a decision that would haunt him until his death 23 years later. He placed the contents back in the box, sealed it, and locked it in the courthouse vault alongside the letters. Then he returned to Dunmore Hall and told Colonel Dunmore in private exactly what had been found. What Colonel Dunmore did next would become the subject of whispered speculation for generations. He ordered every searcher from his property immediately. He canceled the reward. He sent word to every contact in Virginia, North Carolina, and beyond that the search was over. His daughter, he announced, had died, taken ill suddenly and buried in an unmarked grave to avoid scandal. Samuel, he claimed, had been found dead 2 counties away, shot while resisting capture. Both statements were lies, but they were lies that protected something Colonel Dunmore valued more than truth: the reputation of his family and the social order he had spent his life upholding. Better to claim his daughter dead than to acknowledge what she had done. Better to invent an ending than to allow the real story to continue. But Catherine and Samuel were still alive, still moving north through a landscape that had become exponentially more dangerous, not because of pursuit, which had suddenly mysteriously ceased, but because of what they carried with them, a secret that grew with each passing day. A life that represented the complete destruction of every rule their world was built upon. The abrupt end to the official search created more questions than it answered. In taverns and parlors across Mecklenburg County, people whispered about Colonel Dunnor's strange behavior. Some believed his story about Catherine's death. Others suspected she had been hidden away in an asylum, her mind broken by the ordeal. The most cynical suggested that Dunnor had paid bounty hunters privately to handle the matter quietly away from public scrutiny. Magistrate Howell, sworn to secrecy but burdened by conscience, maintained the official narrative while privately documenting every piece of evidence he could gather. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 1876, reveal a man torn between duty to his friend and horror at the truth he was concealing. In an entry dated April 3, 1853, he wrote, "I have today sealed evidence of a crime that is no crime, of a love that is no love, of a child that cannot exist in the eyes of God or law. May the Lord forgive me for hiding truth, but may he also forgive me if I reveal it." At Dunnor Hall, life attempted to return to normal, but the plantation bore the marks of what had happened. Colonel Dunnor dismissed Taggart within a week, paying him a substantial sum to leave Virginia and never speak of the case. Mrs. Hawthorne remained, but she grew increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in the chapel, praying for Catherine's soul. The house itself seemed to mourn. Rooms that Catherine had managed stood empty and unused, her possessions packed away, her name spoken only in whispers, if at all. The enslaved population at Dunnor Hall understood more than the white family suspected. Samuel had been an outsider among them, but his literate status had made him valuable in ways the masters never recognized. He had written letters for those who couldn't write, read documents that affected their lives, and quietly shared information about the broader world. His disappearance with Catherine became a source of complex emotions. Some saw it as reckless and dangerous, inviting retaliation on all of them. Others viewed it as an impossible dream briefly realized. In the months that followed, rumors filtered back through the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across state lines. A couple matching Catherine and Samuel's description had been seen in Pennsylvania. Someone had sheltered them in a Quaker household near the Maryland border. A woman claiming to be a widow from Virginia had given birth in a boarding house in Philadelphia. These rumors reached Dunnor Hall through circuitous routes, a word passed from a traveling peddler to a kitchen worker, a letter delivered to the wrong address and quietly shared before being destroyed. Colonel Dunnor heard none of them. Or if he did, he gave no sign. He had built a wall around the truth, and he maintained it with grim determination. But walls, however sturdy, cannot hold forever against the pressure of truth. And 6 months after Catherine and Samuel's flight, that truth would force its way into the light in a manner no one could have anticipated. The revelation began not in Virginia, but in a small town in southern Ohio called Ripley, a notorious stop on the Underground Railroad. In September 1853, a Presbyterian minister named John Rankin, known for his abolitionist activities, received a letter from Philadelphia. The letter, signed with a name Rankin didn't recognize, requested assistance in contacting certain parties in Virginia regarding a legal matter of inheritance. Rankin, suspicious of any communication that mentioned Virginia and inheritance in the same breath, common tricks used by slave catchers, initially ignored the letter. But a second letter arrived 2 weeks later. This one more explicit. It contained information that could only have come from someone intimately familiar with Mecklenburg County, Virginia, and it mentioned Colonel James Dunnor by name. Intrigued despite his caution, Rankin replied to a Philadelphia address asking for clarification. What he received in return was a 9-page letter that detailed the events of March 1853 from Catherine's perspective, written in her own hand. The letter explained their flight, confirmed their marriage by a sympathetic minister in Pennsylvania, and detailed the birth of a daughter in August 1853. But the letter's primary purpose was neither explanation nor justification. Catherine was writing because Samuel was dead. He had died in early September, killed not by slave catchers or vengeful pursuers, but by typhoid fever contracted in the crowded Philadelphia boarding house where they had been living. Catherine, alone with an infant daughter in a city where she knew no one and possessed no family connections, was destitute. She was requesting that Rankin act as an intermediary to contact her father to ask if any reconciliation might be possible, if he might acknowledge his granddaughter, if not his daughter. Rankin, deeply moved and deeply troubled, faced an impossible decision. He believed in helping fugitives, but Catherine was not legally a fugitive. She had broken no law by leaving Virginia. Samuel had been, but Samuel was dead. The child, under Virginia law, would have been born into slavery, the property of Colonel Dunmore. But in Pennsylvania, she was free. What exactly was he being asked to facilitate? After much deliberation and prayer, Rankin wrote to Magistrate Howell, whom he knew by reputation to be a man of integrity, if not abolitionist sympathies. His letter, carefully worded to avoid incriminating anyone, explained that he had been contacted by a young woman claiming to be Colonel Dunmore's daughter and asking if any reconciliation might be possible. Howell received the letter in late October 1853. He sat in his office for an hour, the letter on his desk, before finally deciding what he had to do. He rode to Dunmore Hall that same afternoon. Colonel Dunmore received him in the study where Samuel had once worked. Howell explained the situation as gently as possible, then waited for the response he dreaded. What Colonel Dunmore said, recorded in Howell's journal, was this: "I have no daughter. I have no. If this woman in Philadelphia persists in using my family name, inform her that I will pursue legal action for fraud. She is to contact me no further. Tell Rankin the same." Howell tried to reason with him. "James, she's your daughter. Your grandchild." "I have no daughter," Colonel Dunmore repeated, his voice like iron. "And I have no grandchild. The matter is closed." Howell left defeated and wrote to Rankin explaining that reconciliation was impossible. He enclosed a small sum of his own money, asking Rankin to see it delivered to Catherine with his apologies for her father's response. Catherine's reply, when it came weeks later, was brief. She thanked Rankin and Howell for their attempts. She explained that she had found work as a seamstress and was managing, barely, to support herself and her daughter. She asked for no further assistance. The letter's final paragraph would be quoted in abolitionist newspapers for years after. "I knew when I chose this path that I was choosing to die to my former life. I did not anticipate how literal that death would be, but I would make the same choice again because the alternative was a living death of the spirit that I could no longer endure. My daughter will grow up free, and that is worth any sacrifice." The letter found its way through Rankin's connections to abolitionist publications in Philadelphia and Boston. They printed it without Catherine's name, identifying her only as a young Virginia woman of good family who chose love and liberty over the comforts of slavery. The story spread, became part of abolitionist literature, was referenced in speeches and sermons. In Virginia, those who read these accounts and recognized the details maintained their silence. Colonel Dunmore never acknowledged the publications. Magistrate Howell kept his documentation locked away. Mrs. Hawthorne continued her prayers. The plantation worked its cycles of planting and harvest as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The social fabric that seemed so solid, so eternal, had revealed itself to be more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. If Colonel Dunmore's own daughter could choose an enslaved man over her birthright, what did that say about the system everyone depended upon? If love could transcend the barriers everyone insisted were natural and absolute, what else might prove less permanent than it appeared? These were dangerous questions, and they were not discussed openly, but they lingered in the silence, in the careful way people avoided mentioning Catherine's name, in the speed with which Colonel Dunmore aged over the following years. And in Philadelphia, Catherine Dunmore, she kept her name, refusing to hide her origin, raised her daughter in a 2-room apartment above a tailor's shop. She worked long hours at her sewing, attended a small Presbyterian church, and told her daughter stories about her father, carefully chosen stories that emphasized Samuel's intelligence, his kindness, his courage. The daughter, named Sarah, grew up knowing she was different, but not fully understanding why until she was older. She knew her father had died before she could know him. She knew her mother had left Virginia under difficult circumstances. She knew her grandfather refused to acknowledge their existence. What she didn't know, what Catherine never told her, a secret Catherine would carry to her grave, was the full complexity of the choice her parents had made, the network of deception and planning that had been required, and the contents of the sealed documents in the Mecklenburg County Courthouse that would remain hidden for another generation. Those documents stayed sealed until 1889, when Magistrate Howell's son, sorting through his father's effects after his death, discovered the copies of the letters and the unfinished note about Catherine's pregnancy. Shocked by what he read, he debated for weeks before finally deciding to make the documents public. By then, Catherine had been dead for 3 years, buried in a Philadelphia cemetery under a headstone that identified her simply as beloved mother. Colonel Dunmore had died in 1871, never having spoken his daughter's name again after 1853. Most of the principals were dead. The plantation system they had all been part of had collapsed in the Civil War, and the world that had made Catherine and Samuel's choice so impossible had transformed beyond recognition. When Howell's son published the letters in a Richmond newspaper, they caused a brief scandal, then faded into the archives of forgotten history. A few aging abolitionists wrote articles praising Catherine's courage. A few Southern apologists condemned her betrayal. But mostly people read the story, shook their heads at the tragedy of it all, and moved on. What they didn't know, what the letters themselves couldn't reveal, was that the story they thought they knew was still incomplete. Because there had been one more letter, never sent, never read, and never included in the courthouse records. A letter that would have changed how everyone understood what had really happened in March 1853. That letter, written by Samuel in the weeks before their escape, had been hidden in a place no one thought to search, and it would remain hidden for another 60 years until a renovation of the building that had once housed Samuel's office would reveal a space between the walls where a tin box had been carefully concealed. Inside that box, Samuel's letter, addressed to the one person who had made their escape possible. The one person whose role in the story had never been suspected. But that discovery was still decades away. In 1853, as winter approached and the scandal faded from immediate consciousness, the people of Mecklenburg County returned to their lives, convinced they understood what had happened, even as the truth remained carefully buried beneath layers of